are eligible. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, those numbers are scant comfort to people with disabilities who cannot qualify for retraining after being injured. Mr. Speaker, we know our declining population is going to cause worker shortages over the long term. We need all individuals contributing to our economy. Individuals with disabilities want to work. However, they often struggle with job searches because they don't have the appropriate support. And before organizations can provide the support, these folks are forced to wait 3 years under the Skills Development Program eligibility requirements. My question to the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development, will you remove the 3-year eligibility requirement for individuals with disabilities?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little confused by the question, and I'm not sure if the member is asking about people who get benefits through the Workers' Compensation Program or the skills development funding. But obviously she has some concerns, and I would be very willing to set up a meeting with my staff and perhaps a representative from the Independent Workers' Compensation Board to come over and to explain the various programs and what's available. Certainly under the LMA and LMDA money, we've been able to free up significant funding for persons with disabilities, and certainly are doing more in that line than we've ever been able to do as a province. So we're also looking at other marginalized groups like Canadian African citizens, Aboriginal citizens, women. So we understand the demands of the future workforce, and you can be sure that we are taking a leadership role in meeting those demands and meeting the needs of individuals. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did not say that these people had become disabled on the job, so no, I wasn't referring to workers' compensation. There are over 198,000 persons with disabilities in Nova Scotia. 68% of those people are unemployed. Many of them are on income assistance. My question is to the Minister of Community Services. Will you ask the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development to change her department's requirements to make it easier for persons with disabilities to get training?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, because it gives me the opportunity to express the fact that we do work interdepartmentally in this government, and one of the things that we are doing is that we're doing the ESIA redesign, which is looking at that entire aspect, which presently those with disabilities are part of that. And the other thing, for the first time in the province of Nova Scotia, this government, through the Department of Community Services and in discussions with my colleague here, the Minister for Labour and Workforce, has brought together a working group of individuals in the province to develop a strategy for those who have a disability, and this will be part of that strategy that they will analyze. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. New Page is the main employer in the Strait area, and its positive economic impact affects regions represented by our member from Guysborough Sheet Harbour, our member from Richmond, member from Antigonish, my colleague from Victoria, in my own riding of Inverness, Colchester, and the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. And actually, if I didn't mention, I did intend to mention the Pictou counties as well, our members who represent those areas. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have many personal friends who work at New Page, and they are a responsible employer. They plant more trees than they harvest. They have certification seals on their products to offer peace of mind that the wood that has been harvested for their products and the products that they've manufactured have been done so responsibly. Will this government ensure that the forestry regulations they bring forward will take into account the economic impact of their decisions?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes.
The honourable member for Inverness and your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to hear that, and I'm hoping that that is the case because the industry will also be pleased to hear that. Mr. Speaker, the people who work in forestry, they make a living not just by cutting trees, but also by helping young trees rejuvenate our forests. I've spoken with these people. I do believe their hearts are in the right place, and I know that they care about the land that they live in and the land that they work on. The new forestry policy that we've been hearing about seems to be more focused on regulations and on a heavy hand by government. Why don't we choose to focus our resources less on bureaucracy and more on generous silviculture programs so these people can earn a better living and that we can optimize the health of our forests? Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, if the member opposite is hearing about the heavy hand of regulation, he's not hearing it from me, Mr. Speaker. It's our intention to bring about change. Some of that change we expect will have to be regulated. We're hoping that as much of that can be done to move the industry and thinking a lot about small private woodlot owners in this vision of a new forest for the province, that we can offer incentives that would be helpful to them. Use the carrot rather than a stick. But so as much as we can aid this process along without being heavy-handed, that would be our intention, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Inverness and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to hear that this is the approach by government because this is a very important industry for our province. And I will ask the minister, do you think that we can come up with a common sense solution so that the interests of industry are served as well as the interests that are obviously trying to be served with the direction that you're presenting?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I'm not sure where the member opposite gets his information. This is not just about industry. It's about the people. It's the people in Nova Scotia who indicated how they want their forests managed. Mr. Speaker, New Page, I would have to say, has set the bar very high for the industry. They have done things and gone to places where others have not been willing to go in the industry. FSC certification, no use of pesticides or herbicides in their operation. I got to say, Mr. Speaker, these are people that will not notice any significant change from what we do, I can tell you that.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Yesterday, many members of the legislature had the opportunity to meet a group of volunteers who joined us here to talk about living with cancer and the stresses financially of doing that. And the principal focus of that discussion yesterday was national, and it was on the National Catastrophic Drug Program that's so desperately needed in Canada. But I wanted to raise today some of the other issues that also face people with cancer in our province. And the Minister is well aware that there are other programs within her own department that would be of great assistance to people who have cancer in our province. One of those is the Boarding, Transportation and Ostomy Program, which provides financial assistance to cancer patients for medically necessary travel in our province. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister please confirm for the record that the income threshold for the BTO program is still fixed at $15,720?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Cancer and treatments indeed are provided in various programs, and that particular program that the member has referred to does have income threshold, and it did not change this year.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And given the fact that inflation has increased over many years since this has ever been moved, in fact, my understanding is we haven't increased that threshold since 1994. So it's been many years of pressure on inflation, even most recently the 2% that has been added thanks to the NDP's government decision to increase HST. At the same time, individuals have higher incomes based just on minimum wage, which means today even someone working at a minimum wage job with cancer might find themselves unable to access that program. So the low income cutoff that Stats Canada has given for a family of 3 living in rural Nova Scotia is $18,263, while a similar sized family in HRM, the low income cutoff would be $23,610. So my question to the minister is, how can a BTO income cutoff, which ranges anywhere from $2,500 to $7,800 below the low-income cutoff level, ever be considered a better deal for Nova Scotian families?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, every day we make choices in the Department of Health about how we can improve health care by investing strategically, Mr. Speaker. One of the choices we've made with respect to treatment for cancers was to increase the new drug program that we have by $10 million in expenditure over the last year, Mr. Speaker. And this really does allow for people to have access to the intravenous drugs that are required in the treatment of cancer. Cancer Care Nova Scotia does a terrific job, as well as the Canadian Cancer Society, in supporting people who need treatments, who are traveling. Many charitable organizations are involved in helping people get the treatments they need. And Mr. Speaker, we continue to review all of our programs and invest in them while trying to live within our means, which often is not an easy thing to do in the Department of Health, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We live in one of the highest tax jurisdictions in the entire country, and yet we find ourselves in a position where we're always turning to nonprofit organizations and to fundraising and so on to try and provide some of the basic needs that our citizens have. Mr. Speaker, in 2008, the honourable member from Sackville-Cobequid, when he was in opposition, raised this very question of the threshold for the BTO. And in 2009, the honourable member from Pictou East made the same request to the government of the day. Yet those suffering from cancer that require financial assistance for board and transportation in order to go to the centres where they can receive chemotherapy and the drugs they so badly need are having no additional help from government. The threshold level is too low, Mr. Speaker. As I said, it has not been raised since 1994, and I believe that the minister needs a plan to do so. So my question to the minister is, when can Nova Scotians expect the minister to increase this income threshold for these very important services that are needed under the BTO program?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. And as I said earlier, in the fiscal year we're currently in, there was no change in that program. But as we go forward, Mr. Speaker, toward our next budget year, every program will be reviewed, and we will be looking at where we need to be making strategic investments to provide better health care to Nova Scotians, and this program certainly will be one that we will have a look at, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Kings County RCMP have redirected funding for the school liaison position in Western Kings schools. This has left these schools without an important resource and the community without an important connection with their law enforcement. Mr. Speaker, could the Minister of Justice explain why these schools have lost their RCMP liaison officer?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
If my memory serves me right, there's the discussions with the district commander there to address that issue, and that there should be realignment of resources in September. On the issue, I also understand that they're placed the position under the as an analyst for dealing with prolific offenders. And what that will mean is that by identifying the crime pattern, they'll be able to address that and reduce that impact, which should free up frontline officers to do more community work. So I'm very encouraged by the leadership within the RCMP there to address those community issues. And I do know that the RCMP are in direct contact with community leaders in the school itself.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, King's RCMP are experiencing what District Inspector Mike Payne hopes is a short-term pressure. So, Speaker, this liaison position is an important one for the students, from the community, and from the school board members to central office to school principals, teachers, and now students have been raising their voice of concern. Quite frankly, this is precisely one of those places where our officers need to be. Call it boots in the halls, if you will. They make a difference. Mr. Speaker, will the province be acting to help fill the gap in the Western King schools?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
The Justice Department is very committed to supporting all Nova Scotians and all communities with ensuring that there's good crime prevention programs there, and that we do as much as we can to reduce crime and support our communities. And I'm very confident that the resourcing issues within that community will be managed by the RCMP District Commander.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, District Inspector Mike Payne sees the importance of this program, so does the community. The community is rallying together to have this position reinstated. Mr. Payne is quoted as saying he fully supports his efforts. This program rolls out important, proactive programming to students of all ages. That the province saw fit to let this happen is simply unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, what is the government doing to ensure that the position of school liaison for Western King schools is reinstated as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, the RCMP manages the resources. They have that responsibility. I have all the confidence in their leadership and that they're working with the community to address the community priorities and needs. But I do go back that I am of the understanding that the resourcing, there are some shifts to deal with the putting analyst positions in place, which is a good step forward in reducing the overall crime impact and should free up the officers to even have more contribution to crime prevention and community involvement and be engaged with the students. And as a former police officer, I was very committed then to the students and people in my community, and as Justice Minister, I'm equally as committed.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. We are running out of time. His answers have been very brief today, so I expect maybe we'll get to the end of this today. I trust you have, as Minister, had the opportunity to read Dr. Wagner's report relating to forestry as a part of Nova Scotia's natural resource. Mr. Wagner, the director of University of Maine School of Forestry and a distinguished professor, reviewed the documents making up Nova Scotia's natural resource strategy, and he was dismayed at the crucial recommendations about the future management. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the minister is, how does the minister react to Mr. Wagner's statements?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't give them as much weight as I give the statements of the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Wagner's credentials, I think, speak for themselves. My question again through you to the minister. Dr. Wagner concluded that Nova Scotia only harvested 1.1% of its forest, and in fact, this would suggest that the entire forest in Nova Scotia would take 1 century to harvest. So my question is, do you believe there's more wood leaving Nova Scotia now than Dr. Wagner is suggesting?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
I think the member's question was around harvest, not what's leaving.
Order, order. The time for oral question period has expired. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, during question period, the member from Dartmouth East attempted to ask a question which you ruled out of order without even hearing the question. Mr. Speaker, I realize in the preamble the former chief clerk's name was brought up, and I recognize it is a sensitive issue for this government. But the members on this side of the House have a right to ask that question. We all know, as Nova Scotians know, the former chief clerk sealed his fate on June 9th when he questioned the decision of this government to take the independence of the Speaker's office and move it into the Department of Finance's office. Mr. Speaker, you also know that the day you walked into his office and fired him, he called our House Leader. Mr. Speaker, you also know the day you fired him, Mr. Speaker, you said, I'm just delivering the message.
That's
Mr.
out of order.
Mr. Speaker,
I'll allow you to have a point of order, but watch your language, please.
Mr. Speaker, you said, let's be clear, you said when you walked in his office, I'm just the messenger. What we want to know, when the finance minister is traveling across this province, asking Nova Scotians to tighten their belts, why they are unwilling to answer the question, how much they paid the former clerk to leave his office quietly, and why Nova Scotians don't have a right to know. Mr. Speaker, you should allow the questions to be asked in this House so that Nova Scotians can get the answer.
It's not a point of order. It's not a point of order. Sorry, no.
Speaker, it's a point of order. You cannot rule a question out of order without hearing the question.
I heard enough of the question.
Mr. Speaker, there was no question. You haven't got there yet. You still don't know. Tell this House what the question was.
Thank you. Are we ready for the government? No, the Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm rising on a point of privilege. Mr. Speaker, I've been around this House a long time, and Mr. Speaker, in my 18 years coming up in this place, I've never seen a worse example of a Speaker protecting the government. This is the worst I've ever seen. Your ruling, Mr. Speaker, was I believe, was contemptuous without even hearing a question. And, Mr. Speaker, the chief clerk, Mr. Speaker, is a public employee, was a public employee, paid for by the people of this province and only under the direction of the Speaker's office.
I ruled it out of order because any matter that belongs under the jurisdiction of the Speaker
is not responsible to this place. Is that what you're saying?
Is not under the...
Are you saying that the people that you're employed by are not responsible? We can't ask questions in this House?
You're certainly entitled
on
to
members,
ask
on people who work for the people of Nova Scotia? But you ruled it out of order.
If it's under the jurisdiction of the Speaker, it is out of order. Simple as that.
It's not out of order, Mr. Speaker. It's an open matter that should be dealt with in open.
Well,
we have the right to ask those questions.
These are the rules.
We have the right to find out, Mr. Speaker, why this government paid over $340,000 to the chief clerk to have him leave quietly, as our leader has said.
Okay,
That's the question here, Mr. Speaker, and I'm telling you that you have made a decision in favor of the government here, and Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time that you've made decisions in favor of the government and not in favor of the independence of this place here, Mr. Speaker. So I think my privileges have been stepped on here today, and the privileges of all members of this House by you, Mr. Speaker. I think you should do the honourable thing, Mr. Speaker, and resign.
I hear your concern. The Honourable PC Leader in the House.
Thank you. I like to stand on a point of order as well, but not as contemptuous as that, Mr. Speaker. In a response to the member for Digby Annapolis, the Minister of Fisheries referenced a moratorium on aquaculture by the previous government. And I know full well that there was no such moratorium on aquaculture. So I want the member to provide this House with documentation to prove there was a moratorium, or at least apologize that he maybe got his facts wrong on that. The only thing that I remember from our time in government was an issue around Queens and having to say no to an aquaculture site in Queens, in Port Mattoon. And I'm sure the member for Queens would have agreed with that decision at that time. So my point of order today is that I'd like the Minister of Fisheries to provide us with more detail on this so-called moratorium, or apologize for getting it wrong.
It's certainly a difference of opinion between the two members, but I will, that's all I can say at this point in time. I'll recognize the Honourable Government House, or the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Can we call Bill number 78, the Public Utilities Act?
Bill number 78, the public point of order by the Honourable PC Leader in the House.
Mr. Speaker, by no way is this a difference of opinion. The minister referenced a document, a statement, that there was a moratorium on aquaculture, and I want him to be able to prove that fact in this House. Provide the documentation on that. If you reference it, it's in your briefing book. Where is it? There was no such thing. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like you to rule on it and again get him to provide the information to this House.
Okay, a point well taken. I will take it under advisement. You're welcome. The bill on second reading, the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's again a pleasure to rise and speak again to Bill 78 on the Public Utilities Act. I'd like to just restate some of what I had noted before, and in support of our good NDP government, and just to say very loud and clear that we do support Nova Scotia small businesses. Our minister, by bringing this forward, our government, and certainly our premier, we stand today united that Nova Scotia values, respects, and listens to Nova Scotian small business people. I speak as well from experience of having been a small businesswoman in my life. I had the pleasure of operating successfully, but yet challenging at times, small businesses at my home in Eastern Passage. I have to say that it's particularly relevant, I think, as an MLA to speak to this bill when we think of the types of businesses that we're talking about who will be so positively affected by it. The mom and pop restaurants in our local communities, the cottage industries where people are working hard within their own homes to help provide for their families, the retail outlets that we might frequent to get our bread and milk, the pastry shops within our communities, the gas stations, and the list goes on and on. They're everywhere. They make up the hearts of our neighbourhoods and our communities across Nova Scotia. The appointment of the small business advocate can make or break or can influence the decisions that can make or break small businesses when decisions are before the Public Utilities Review Board. Having an advocate there, having a voice, having someone that knows what it's like to face the challenges that Nova Scotia small businesses are facing can make a huge difference in the deliberations. These people, this person that will be that advocate with the support of this House, really know what it takes when you put your heart and soul into this type of business, what it takes for family support, what it takes for financial support, what it takes in energy and sweat equity. The expansion of the definition as well opens doors and opportunities for Nova Scotians, opening to the opportunity for corporation partnerships and proprietorships. The hearings, having at the hearings the opportunity for a small business person to be a dedicated intervener is the right thing to do. We know that because we've spoken to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, as a government that cares and wants to talk directly to the people that we're here representing. We had that opportunity, we heard from them, and we're moving on that. We know, Mr. Speaker, we know that business in Nova Scotia is strong. We know that it can be stronger, and legislation like this will help in that regard. We want to do things that will give opportunities to Nova Scotians to be successful. This government, Mr. Speaker, this NDP minister, this NDP premier is responding, and with that we know I want to pay particular attention to the endorsement that we had from Ms. Leanne Hatchie from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that speaks volumes, that we are hitting the mark here in government for Nova Scotians, and with that I'll take my place and I ask that the entire legislature support this bill. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, Geez, I was in a good mood when I came in here, so I'm going to keep my remarks short so that I don't get in a worse mood. You know, we're glad to see this bill. We're very happy to see this move forward. It's entertaining to listen to both the Finance Minister and the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage say how they're very happy to have CFIB support since on April 16th, 2010, and I'll table this, the comment the quote from the Finance Minister was, "I'm not planning to meet with the CFIB." They just issued a vitriolic news release, and I don't find it terribly helpful. So apparently they're helpful when they're on his side, but they're not helpful when they're not on his side. I will table that, of course, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Finance Minister. The CFIB is a very important organization in the province and represents a large sector of our economy. And while it is reasonable for the Minister and the government not to always agree with them, certainly very reasonable, he can't attack them one day as an organization that should have their leadership replaced, and then a few months later say that he thinks their leadership is great. The same people, mind you, for supporting him in this. You know, the fact of the matter is it's disingenuous at best. Mr. Speaker, we're certainly glad to see this. I know the Finance Minister talked about his support for that previously, and he'll remember, of course, that our own colleague from Richmond tabled a bill requiring this very thing, a business consumer advocate, Bill number 3 on November 23rd, 2007. We recognized at the time that, or we've recognized since that it didn't work out exactly as intended, and the Minister of Finance has brought forward now those changes to improve that. Mr. Speaker, there have been a couple of people stand up and make comments from the government benches that this is good because there will be people representing small businesses and others at the Utility and Review Board, and certainly it's good to have somebody there, and we support that, but I would remind the members of the government that they can always go themselves as MLAs to the Utility and Review Board hearings and appear on behalf of the constituents and small businesses in their riding, just as I have on a number of hearings in the past couple of weeks. So it is not necessary just to rely on others to go there, and I hope, while I haven't seen any NDP members at any of the power rate hearings or gas hearings recently, I look forward to hopefully some of them might join me there at future rate hearings. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will take my place. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have spoken on this bill already, and today I would like to reiterate the Progressive Conservative member's support for the bill. We do believe that small business should have their own advocate when matters relevant to them are discussed at the Utility and Review Board. So with that, I will keep my remarks brief and add our support to the bill.
Okay. If I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance, it will be to close debate on this Bill 78. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank all members for their observations on the bill and move second reading.
The question is for second reading on Bill number 78. The question's been called. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 78, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you now call Bill number 79, the Securities Act?
Bill number 79, the Securities Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise on second reading of Bill number 79, which contains a variety of amendments to the Securities Act. Now, members of the House will recall that over the past little while there have been a number of amendments to the Securities Act, Mr. Speaker, because it is part of an ongoing national effort to have mirror legislation essentially in all provinces across Canada. Part of the effort, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the difficulty that securities regulation is within the jurisdiction of the provinces although in some other countries it's within the jurisdiction of the national government. So by having mirror legislation across the country, essentially we can come as close as is possible within the constitutional framework of acting as a single securities regulator, or as close as we can get to it within the constraints set to by our confederation. Mr. Speaker, in the current financial climate, the ability to invest and participate in the global market is critical. These amendments ensure that the Nova Scotia Securities Act will reflect the adoption by Canada of International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS. And it will also establish a framework for the regulation of credit rating organizations. The purpose is to ensure appropriate securities regulation is in place and to ensure that our regulatory regime is in line with national and international standards. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the first item, the adoption of IFRS, it's necessary to amend the Securities Act to ensure that financial reporting filings are consistent with IFRS requirements being adopted by the Canadian Accounting Standards Board of the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. Those standards will require that for Canadian publicly accountable enterprises that they adopt IFRS as of January 1st, 2011. The amendments in this bill, Mr. Speaker, primarily reflect IFRS terminology changes. The International Financial Reporting Standards have been adopted in over 100 countries, including countries of the European Union. And it is, of course, Mr. Speaker, important that our securities legislation be consistent in Canada's financial reporting standards. There's been a lot of talk over the years, Mr. Speaker, at least over the years I've been in the House, of generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP or GAAP, and this is simply another step in the evolution of GAAP, and it reflects the fact that the Securities Act has to keep up with that evolution. Now, Mr. Speaker, the next set of amendments has to do with the regulation of credit rating organizations. I have to admit that this is a bit of an oddity. I said in the opening of my remarks that the idea here is to ensure that there is essentially mirror legislation across Canada. And so we're adopting these amendments, which are being adopted elsewhere in Canada, even though there is, as a matter of fact, no credit rating organization based in Nova Scotia. But if there ever were one, these rules would apply, and these same rules have either been adopted in other provinces or will be adopted in other provinces to ensure that there is a seamless securities regime across Canada, or as I keep saying, Mr. Speaker, as close as you can get to that within the constraints of the Canadian federal system. Credit rating organizations are not currently subject to formal securities regulatory oversight in Canada. The initiative to regulate credit rating organizations flows from recommendations of the Canadian Securities Administrators in response to the 2007-2008 credit market turmoil. The Canadian Securities Administrators have worked hard to ensure that appropriate regulations are adopted in Canada, which are consistent with the international community. So these amendments, Mr. Speaker, will do four things. First, they will make rules to designate a credit rating organization. Second, they provide for compliance reviews of a credit rating organization. Third, they will require a credit rating organization to provide access to their books, information, and other documents. And fourth, they will order a credit rating organization to submit to review of its practices and procedures where such an order is in the public interest. Compliance reviews will be coordinated nationally by provincial and territorial securities regulators. This legislation will, of course, Mr. Speaker, not direct or regulate the content of credit ratings or the methodologies used to determine credit ratings, because in order to be credible, Mr. Speaker, the credit rating organizations must be independent in the content of their ratings. I might point out, Mr. Speaker, that part of the genesis of this kind of regulation lay in the fact that credit rating organizations were perhaps not as independent of the entities being rated as they ought to have been, and so there was some suggestion that their ratings were not perhaps as objective as they could have been, and therefore that this led in some part, directly or indirectly, to the market turmoil that we've seen over the last couple of years. Enacting a harmonized framework in Nova Scotia will allow proposed national rules on credit rating organizations to be implemented in Nova Scotia concurrent with other Canadian jurisdictions. There are a number of other amendments which I can only call housekeeping amendments, Mr. Speaker. Simply very small things to ensure consistency with legislation in other Canadian jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, amendments to Section 30 of the Securities Act will clarify that a self-regulatory organization has authority over former members and representatives, and will clarify that the Nova Scotia Securities Commission can review and approve any bylaw, rule, regulation, policy, procedure, interpretation, or practice of a recognized self-regulatory organization. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to point out that this bill does not, of course, have anything to do at all with the move towards a single national securities regulator. That is an initiative of the federal government which Nova Scotia supports. We have indicated to the federal government that we support the move to a single regulator on 5 conditions which I've gone over previously in the House and will not review now because it's not directly germane to the contents of this bill. But if the day comes, Mr. Speaker, where a national securities regulator is established and is found by the Supreme Court of Canada to be lawful, that in fact this House will no longer see securities regulation because it will be managed at the national level for the whole country. But until we get to that day, Mr. Speaker, which if it happens is still a number of years away, it is through amendments such as these that we can ensure an efficient and effective market for securities in Nova Scotia and in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased today to offer a few comments on Bill 79. It has been well detailed by the minister in his opening remarks, and as he did say, the bill is intended to reflect the requirements of the international financial reporting standards and being adopted by Canada. And the idea here, of course, is to harmonize reporting standards right across the country, and of course provinces are falling in line in order to make that goal realized. The Nova Scotia Securities Act must be consistent with IFRS requirements being adopted by the Canadian Accounting Standards Board for Canadian policy accountable enterprises by January 1st, 2011. And the bill allows for the government to develop regulations for credit rating organizations which will be consistent with the international community. These regulations allow securities regulators the power to make rules with respect to, and there are a number of areas, designating a credit rating organization, conduct compliance reviews of a credit rating organization, and require them to provide access to books, information, and documents. Also order a credit rating organization to submit a review of its practices and procedures where such an order is in the public interest. The legislation will not direct or regulate the content of credit ratings or the methodologies used to determine credit ratings. These amendments are being enacted across jurisdictions in our country. Amendments to Section 30 should clarify authority over former members with regards to self-regulatory organizations. Amendments to Section 30 should clarify that the Nova Scotia Securities Commission can review and approve any bylaw, rule, regulation, policy, procedure, interpretation, or practice of a recognized self-regulatory organization. I guess, Mr. Speaker, it'd be important to point out that further details are to come in regard to regulations, and we'll see how they fit into the framework. These amendments seem to allow for greater transparency and streamlined processes and self-regulatory functions. This is good in principle. However, we will watch closely for the regulations, and I will look forward to this bill moving on to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. I'll recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we on the within the Progressive Conservative members on this side of the House are in agreement with this legislation. There are 3 points, as the honourable member has stated. The first is the international accounting standards, reporting standards. It's something that's being driven by the accounting industry. This is a good thing for the world over. Any time when we can have financial reporting by companies consistent around the world, it's good for a couple of reasons. One, because our world is global today. There are a lot of companies that are working with each other around the world, and there's a lot of people who are investing in these companies. And when they look at balance sheets and operating statements, they need to know that there is some standard. And if that standard is consistent globally, then there is confidence that what is on the paper is a true representation of what is happening with that company, and they can be assured if they're going to invest in that company or deal with that company that they're doing so in good faith and with a level of proper knowledge on what is going on. The second piece is on the credit agencies, and Mr. Speaker, this is also very important. Most people in this room would have been affected by the downturn in the stock market. Our pension plans have been affected by it. And one of the things that's caused this was the real estate market in the United States. And what was happening is there were a lot of people getting loans for homes who could not afford those loans. In fact, they had a term for it. They called it ninja loans, because these people had no income, no jobs, and no assets. And as you can expect, Mr. Speaker, the effect of giving people loans who could not afford to pay them had a devastating effect on the U.S. economy, created a housing bubble, and the rating agencies played a role in that. Sadly, they were stamping good quality ratings on companies who had assets that were very weak. And we hear about the term asset-backed securities, and this was a case where bad loans were mixed in with a few good ones, and because the company that was fronting these asset-backed securities had a good, reputable name, the rating agencies turned a blind eye to what was in those securities and gave them a good quality rating. So people invested in them, and then eventually the markets, the housing market went flat, and these securities weren't worth what people thought they were. In fact, they were much more risky. So this legislation is going to help bring greater accountability for those rating agencies so that doesn't happen again. And we recognize the value in that, Mr. Speaker. The third component gives the Securities Commission jurisdiction over the organizations in this country that regulate the investment advisors. And this is of great importance because many people in this province, most people, rely on advisors to ensure the decisions they make around their finances bring them healthy outcomes. And probably the main mode of savings for people in this province is for their retirement and for their retirement income. So this legislation is good because it can give confidence to investors that the people they're dealing with are reputable. And it allows the Commission to go back to look at the actions of former licensed advisors to ensure that those people are held accountable. If they're not held accountable, what confidence can we have in this important industry? And I do think the industry would also welcome these changes, because anything that's done to ensure integrity for investors is of value to them, because it brings respect and trust in the industry. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, everybody wants to see people who make investments have positive experiences. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks and summarize by saying that the Progressive Conservative members of this House will be supporting this bill.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Halifax-Shibocto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This bill must be challenging for all of us here. It represents a very specialized area of law and public policy. It's an area that's complicated, and I think it's one of no little importance. Nonetheless, it's an area that many of us will not have direct knowledge of. I certainly don't put myself forward as any expert in this area of the law or public policy, but what little I do know, I'm happy to try to share with members in the House. I think what we might do is start with trying to understand something of the context within which this bill arises. This is a series of amendments to the Securities Act. In Nova Scotia, we do get to regulate securities, but we should understand how they play out in the array of financial institutions that are part of the makeup of the nation's institutions of economic activity. The traditional analysis, of course, of the financial sector is to recognize it as having what have often been called four pillars. The four pillars are banks or credit unions. They are trust, or as they're sometimes known in the United States, savings and loans companies. Then there are insurance companies, and finally, there are securities agencies. Those four pillars were traditionally recommended by analysts to be kept separate. In Canada, we've actually seen some merging of those different functions. We know banks are quite interested in getting into insurance. They've already been able to take over trust companies, and to a certain extent, of course, the major banks also own various securities companies as well. So there's been quite an evolution in the nation of these traditional four pillars. They're not separate as they once were, or not quite so separate as they once were. If one reads Canadian texts of a certain era, my era, when I first learned about this, there was always a drawing in the textbook in which it showed four Doric pillars holding up the roof of the building, and the idea was that the financial affairs of the nation would be solid and secure and well supported so long as the four pillars were all kept separate and independent and healthy. Well, policy has evolved, and there have been, as I say, these mergers, but we still have a serious interest in making sure that the different functions, these institutions, these pillars are kept healthy. So what we're dealing with here, the Securities Act, amendments to it, has to do with the securities agencies, not with banking, not with credit unions, not with trusts, not with insurance, but focused exclusively on this institution having to do with securities. Now, this at the moment is a provincial function. Members will no doubt be aware that the federal government has expressed some interest in the possibility of either a complete merger of the securities commissions and the exchanges, the securities exchanges that exist in different provinces in the country, and they've expressed some interest in the possibility of taking over from the provinces regulation of securities if it would turn out that there were to be one national entity. A committee that was chaired, interestingly enough, by Purdy Crawford, now an eminent and well-respected man of business affairs, originally from Nova Scotia. Purdy Crawford's committee recommended that there be movement in that direction. But as the Honourable Minister said, it's not clear whether this will actually happen, and if it does, it may well not happen for a number of years. As we know, there is some resistance on the part of some provinces which have their own securities commissions. Not all provinces are opposed to it. We have a securities commission in Nova Scotia. We don't have active or so active trading here as there is in Toronto under the Toronto Stock Exchange, or in Montreal in the Montreal Stock Exchange, or in Vancouver where it's generally seen as one of the sort of junior stock exchanges, but an active one nonetheless. But those provinces that do have active stock exchanges and a long tradition of having their own regulation of securities activities are expressing some resistance to Purdy Crawford's suggestion. We will see. We will see how that evolves. But even if it were to be the case that at some point there were one national regulator and one national securities exchange commission, there would probably still be some residual function in our province. And even if there weren't, until we get there, until we get to the point, if we ever do, of seeing one national regulator, we have to be up to date in our Securities Act. And that's what this bill is about. This bill is about making certain amendments to our Securities Act, which provides the framework for our activities when it comes to securities. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think you'll be aware that there are a number of companies that are incorporated in Nova Scotia and that carry on their businesses here and that are registered here. There are traders in securities here. That is, people buy and sell through agents certain shares in these companies. And there has to be a legal framework in order to regulate properly what it is that goes on when it comes to the issuance of shares originally when a company goes public and a variety of transactions. It's quite fascinating to read the existing Securities Act and see what its declared purpose is. The declared purpose of the statute as it stands right now is, and I quote, to provide investors with protection from practices and activities that tend to undermine investor confidence in the fairness and efficiency of capital markets. And also, it goes on to say, an adequate level of investor protection to foster the process of capital formation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I find those words quite interesting. It's rare in a statute that in this province or virtually any other in which you will find such clear language about the process of the dynamics of the economy, capital formation. In other words, how is it that pools of money are to come forward and be employed productively in our economy. And one of the ways in which that happens is through incorporated companies. And to some extent, of course, we should think of the Securities Act as a companion piece of legislation to the Companies Act, which provides for the method of incorporation of companies so that people don't do business simply as one person or as partners, but in fact as an incorporated company with shares. And that's where that's what the Companies Act is all about. And the Securities Act has to do with the process whereby these companies, once incorporated with shares, with shareholders, go public. That is, in which they actually take on more than one or two shareholders, because this is seen as a necessary process so that we can carry on the dynamics of a modern economy. If we look at what the Act does at the moment, there are a whole variety of activities that are set out that are regulated by the Securities Act. Sellers of securities, that is, brokers, are regulated. They're regulated in the sense that they have to be educated appropriately and licensed in order to carry on the business of acting as sellers of securities. They're subject to discipline. In fact, I don't know if you saw today's press releases, but there was, in today's press releases, there was one from Nova Scotia's Security Commission in which a dealer in securities was disciplined because he had violated the rules that are in place. And this was seen as being a detriment to the public. The individual in question was fined, I think, $12,500, had to pay costs of the investigation, and was banned for 2 years from owning shares in any public company in Nova Scotia. So there's a serious apparatus there to oversee the actions of people who are brokers, and it's all for the purpose of providing investors with protection, which is what the preamble and purpose section of the statutes said. Other aspects of the Act have to do with transactions involving the sale and there's a fancy word, hypothecation of shares. So if you want to put up your shares as collateral in some financial transaction, part of the Securities Act has to do with how sales of shares take place and how you can put them up as collateral. There are particular rules in the Securities Act that have to do with IPOs. An IPO, Mr. Speaker, is an initial public offering. That's when a company which might be owned closely and privately by a few people decide to offer their shares to the public for potential purchase. That's known as an IPO. That's the first time that a company goes to the public and says, we are interested in selling our shares to the public. And there are special rules around what should be in the prospectus. The prospectus is the statement that describes what the business is going to do, who owns it, what the parameters of the company are to be, its objectives, and so on. There are special rules around the prospectus and other things having to do with the IPO that are necessary to be in place before trading can take place. Our Securities Act also provides for investigations. Our Securities Commission has quite wide powers to investigate companies that are involved in the public trading of shares, or that, in fact, offer shares to the general public. And there's an interesting test, Mr. Speaker, in the language of the statute right now, because anyone who's an advisor to the public when it comes to buying and selling of shares. They may not be someone who owns shares in the company, but they may be financial advisors. They're obligated under Section 39A to act fairly, honestly, and in good faith. That's the language of the statute right now. That's a positive obligation put upon people who are setting themselves out as financial advisors or as brokers. Furthermore, the Act, in a subsequent section, 44A, defines unfair practices. It talks about things that are specifically unfair practices that might get a broker in trouble. Unfair pressure, for example, or taking advantage of the incapacity or lack of knowledge of a client, or imposing terms that are manifestly inequitable. Now, these are interesting standards. This is wide language. But these are high standards that are imposed by our Securities Act on those who trade in stocks or who advise people who might be thinking of buying stocks. As I said earlier on, this is an area of specialization. But even though the practice of it might be an area of specialization, and even though the law around it might be an area of specialization, there are many members of the public who buy and sell stocks, who go to financial advisors and ask for their advice. So it's important that we keep our Act up to date, that we have the high standards incorporated in this statute that are necessary to foster public confidence, in the purpose words of the statute, and to help capital accumulation so that the enterprise, the economic enterprise of our province can go forward. There are other specific sections of the statute that are quite fascinating. There can be no representations about the future value of the security. Well, that's a good thing. In other words, they can't tell you that this stock is going to go up. Not supposed to say that. If someone does that, they're in a different line of business. They're not in the business of selling stock. The statute regulates margin selling and purchases. Margin selling is buying and selling when you don't have the money to do it, or you don't own the shares. Puts and calls. Interesting thing, dangerous, don't do it. But the statute regulates it. The statute regulates it. You have to make owners of companies principals, that is the people who are the main actors in companies where there's publicly traded shares, have to make certain declarations about whether they have short positions. A short position is when they're making a bet on the market that their own stock is going to go down. Just the kind of thing we saw with some of the financial institutions in the United States. And that's regulated right here in our Securities Act, and so it should be. Takeover bids, insider trading, misrepresentations, the obligation to make disclosure of material facts, all of those are provided for in our statute right now, and that's a good thing. So what is it we're seeing in the amendments that are proposed today? What we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, is a strengthening of this array of offerings to the public in which we try to structure our province's financial institution that keeps an eye on the public trading of stocks here. And the nature of the improvements that we're engaged with is a series of improvements that are commonly being adopted around the nation and internationally. And these have to do really with the nature of reporting of financial information. In other words, there has been some general agreement internationally that the kind of financial information that should be available and reported back by some of these companies as regulated by Securities Acts should be put into a common and understandable form that provides the kind of transparency that is necessary to undermine the capital formation that we want to see, and the investor security that we also, or investor confidence that we also want to see. Mr. Speaker, we've already heard from the Honourable Minister the details about what it is that the amendments are. I don't want to speak again to those. I endorse them entirely. I endorse the bill. I certainly am going to support it. I just wanted to offer a few comments that would give a little bit of context to the bill so that we could all try to understand the nature of the financial apparatus that we're dealing with and that this bill so admirably supports. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to talk.
If I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance, it'll be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank all members for their interventions, particularly the member for Halifax-Chebucto. A very clear and succinct exposition of how the Securities Act works in Nova Scotia. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would move second reading of Bill 79.
The question is for second reading of Bill 79. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favour? Those against? Carried.
Bill number 79, an act to amend Chapter 418 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Securities Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the acting government host leader, the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you now call Bill number 81, Oak Island Treasure Act?
Bill number 81, Oak Island Treasure Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'm really pleased to be able to stand in support of Bill number 81, repeal of the Treasure Trove Act, creation of the Oak Island Treasure Act, and changes to the Special Places Protection Act. This legislation ensures that underwater cultural resources will be protected as heritage objects for the benefit of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And as a result of this bill, treasure hunting for commercial purposes, with the exception of that conducted on Oak Island, will cease on January 1st, 2011. The Treasure Trove Act was enacted in 1954 to govern treasure hunting activities on Oak Island, but was never intended to determine how all of Nova Scotia's marine heritage was managed. So, Mr. Speaker, people don't want treasure hunting activities in our province. And here's a sampling of what they're saying. John Wesley Chisholm is a Halifax diver and noted television producer who works for National Geographic, no less. And when traveling the globe, Mr. Chisholm admits he is ashamed of the way Nova Scotia is treating its marine artifacts. He told the media when we announced this I was always kind of embarrassed in my travels around the rest of the world that the rest of the world takes such good care of their marine cultural heritage, and we didn't in Nova Scotia. Mr. Chisholm has been clamoring for changes to the treasure hunting regulations for years and is thrilled this government is doing what Nova Scotians want, Mr. Speaker. Daryl Kellman, president of the Nova Scotia Archaeological Society, was quoted as saying, "The proposed changes to the law bring the province in line with the rest of the country and the Western world." Another Nova Scotian who was unhappy with treasure hunting in our province was the member for Dartmouth East, and even the member of Dartmouth East, and I agree on this, Mr. Speaker, and he is supportive of the bill. So, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are unhappy that the current policy allows those who explore to keep 90% of their fines, and this doesn't happen anywhere else in our country. Nova Scotians' regulations will now be in line with other jurisdictions in Canada and reflect the United Nations' preferred approach to marine heritage preservation. We will now focus on research and recovery of heritage objects following archaeological best practices. And as for the Oak Island Treasure Act, it will regulate treasure hunting activities carried out on the island. This government appreciates the long history, rich in tradition of treasure hunting in this area, and is respectful of the original intention of permitting and regulating treasure hunting on the island. Changes to treasure hunting regulation that we're making will help ensure that Nova Scotia's marine heritage is preserved for future generations of Nova Scotia families, Mr. Speaker. This isn't about money and chests full of gold coins buried at the bottom of the sea. We're not making these changes to generate revenue and profit for the government from hidden pieces of our past. This is about our protecting what is ours, our historic artifacts and our history. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm expecting that my colleague, the Minister for Tourism, Heritage and Culture, will also have a few words on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we too, as a party, agree with this bill somewhat, but I myself find it quite confusing. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. I mean, it's a bill, it's been introduced to legislation to repeal the Treasure Trove Act, amend the Special Places Protection Act, and create an Oak Island Treasure Act. Now, that's quite confusing in itself, that statement. But another statement that confuses me is ownership of Nova Scotia's underwater cultural and heritage resources will be more secure, according to the government. Underwater. Now, keep that in mind. Underwater. Because I'm going to tell you about some shipwrecks around this shore that isn't underwater. And over the years, these shipwrecks and the treasures aboard of them have come ashore. And I'll tell you why, because I'm quite an avid beach comber. I love beach combing. I'm like Forrest Gump's mother said. She said, it's like a box of chocolates. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Well, when you go beach combing, you never know what you're going to get. I always think of Forrest Gump when I walk on the beach. a relic himself. But I want to talk about what comes up on the beaches, and there is things come up on the beaches from these boats and things. I myself here a few years back found a piece of wood stuck in the sand and rocks. And I thought it was steel. I thought it was metal to begin with, but I got it out, dug it out, and I took it home and dried it out. And I planed this piece of wood down. It was so heavy I thought it was Lincoln Vitae at first. But I found out, a professional person told me it's not Lincoln Vitae. It was an African redwood, African iron redwood that was put into boats like 200 to 300 years ago, somewhere in Africa. I found this on Digby Neck, down Petite Passage. So there's probably a lot more stuff there if you want to go dig around that beach a little. And a lot of people dig around the beaches. I'll tell you another story about some treasure. Back during the war, and this house still stands down on Digby Neck. During the war, there was a ship came from the UK. She was a merchant marine ship. And below Briar Island, she was blown up with a torpedo from a submarine. About a week or two later, a body was found on the beach, and they believed it came out of this boat, and there was a money belt onto this body. That's quite a little treasure. And it was in pounds because that boat was coming to pick supplies up somewhere up in the Bay of Fundy. I don't believe Digby, but I believe probably St. John. So this person that found this, he reported the body, but I don't know if he reported the money or not, but he got enough money out of that money belt to build himself a home, which still stands today down there. So that was quite a treasure on the beach he found. Do you leave it? Do you take it? On the beach, not underwater. So, I mean, I could go on all day here about fishing boats bringing up stuff, cannons, anchors. I see them all over the place. Of fishing boats bringing up these artifacts. There's anchors down on Digby Neck, 200-300 years old. The old anchor had the wooden stocks in them. They put new wooden stocks in them. They got it propped up on their lawns, around parks, cannons too. Are these being protected? Are these going to be protected? They're not underwater anymore. Are the fishermen going to continue to bring these in, or are they going to be afraid now to bring this stuff in and just drop it? Or is it going to create a black market? Will this create a black market, making anything that you take care of and hide away, it makes it more valuable? So maybe it'll create a bigger black market. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here because I know that this stuff goes on, and how much greater will it go on by doing this? You know, I'm not saying that I'm going to, I don't know whether, maybe if I find another piece of African ironwood on the beach, I don't know whether I'll bring it home or not, or should I bring it home? But it wasn't underwater. Remember the underwater. This is what is being stated here, underwater. And a lot of this comes ashore. I know I've lobster fished all my life around the shores. 150-pound wire steel lobster trap out of 90 feet of water, 15 fathom deep, storm big enough to bring that wire trap ashore up into the woods. I've seen that. So there's probably lots of treasure out of these things. Them ships hit the rocks. They was shallower than 90 feet of water. They all hit the rocks there somewhere. So the seas have brought this stuff up into the woods. So are we going to create a lot of treasure hunters up into the shores, away from the waters? I'm just playing devil's advocate here. But this is the stuff that I see that may happen. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I won't go on any more about that, but there's just a few confusing things. There are a few things that I'm confused about. And, but anyway, I look forward to this going to law amendments because I believe there'll be some people in there telling us, you know, that we're trying to come in line with the rest of Canada, but there's a lot of provinces in this country, such as out in the Great Lakes, that they don't have to deal with the Atlantic Ocean. You know, it's a different place, that's for sure. And probably a lot of this stuff will be lost forever. And how can you have a treasure if you don't even know what was there? How can you call a treasure? There was an old boat sunk there. How do we know if there's any treasure, you know? So there's lots of questions about it. So probably in law amendments, we may hear from some people that maybe can fill us in some more on this. So anyway, I look forward to hearing from the Minister of Tourism and Culture and whether the bill is going to be changed some about underwater, on the beach, or on the land, whatever. So with that, I'll take my place. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We understand the value of safeguarding items of cultural significance for Nova Scotia and the intent of this bill to do that. We do want to see what those exploring for treasure and what those who are promoting the cultural value of this preservation of what is found to have a say on this bill when it moves forward to law amendments. Some treasure explorers have stated that they do respect cultural significance of the finds that they've been finding, and that they are happy to turn them over to the province for the greater good of the people of the province. I am pleased to see what appears to be some special recognition for Oak Island and the people who have been trying to unlock the mystery behind that island. Mr. Speaker, this is a fascinating story. I think it is one of the top 10 stories in our province that can be told about in the history of our province. If anybody has ever picked up a copy of R.V. Harris's book on Oak Island, that is your source to read. And everybody in this room, it's worth a read because, again, I'll state, Mr. Speaker, I think it's one of the top 10 stories in this province. And it's well known, but it's not, I don't think we've fully appreciated the value of it here. And the value of the story may in fact be worth more than the treasure. So if you go into Mr. Harris's book, which was written, I believe, back in the 50s, or it might have even been the 40s, and it's been a few years now since I've read it, but if you go back to that book, you'll see that it's a very strange story. It was first discovered by people who were passing by the island, and they noticed something hanging from a tree, and from further inspection they decided to start digging. There seemed to be some kind of a pit there, and there's markers all over the island, even away from the supposed treasure site. But when they did look in the shaft, they started finding various things as further they would go within the shaft. They would find things like materials that resembled coconut husks. So it appeared to be man-made, and it appeared to be materials coming from places far away from Nova Scotia. And I even had the benefit a number of years back of seeing some chains, some metal that was found in the shaft. And that metal was sent away for investigation, and the composition of the metal was deemed to be from foundries that would have used formulas to make that metal that would have been hundreds of years old. I have had the benefit to meet with Dan Blankenship, who is still living and who has spent years searching for this treasure. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, it was even within the past year I happened to be taking a nice scenic drive down the South Shore because, as we all know, Mr. Speaker, it is one of the nicer areas of our province to visit.
Next to the
and my colleague, as he so aptly corrects me, next to the Cabot Trail. But it's been recognized, and the Cabot Trail has been recognized. That's right, Mr. Speaker. I believe it's been recognized this year by a motorcycle publication that stated that it was the finest drive in the world for a motorcycle, or at least in North America. And Mr. Speaker, I guess to get back to Mr. Blankenship, I almost didn't go on his property that day because there were signs up that said "Do not trespass," but it was not long after my election, and I was familiar with traversing such places during the election campaign, so I was brave and I decided, well, what the heck, I'm going to go up there anyway, and I did so. And Mr. Blankenship was very kind. And I met with he and his wife, and he was very kind, brought me down to look at some of the things that he's uncovered over the years. And he's dedicated a good portion of his life to trying to find this treasure. And he started, I think it would have been back in the 1960s. And in fact, he almost died in one of the shafts that he was drilling. But he was pulled to the surface. So this man has had a very hands-on experience, and his story and the story of Oak Island was once covered in National Geographic magazine. And it was discovered, or the people at National Geographic had commented that of all the stories they've ever covered in that very prestigious and well-known magazine, well-known around the world, that story on Oak Island was the one they had received the most inquiries about. So there's great public interest in this story, and it's why I say there's an opportunity here, Mr. Speaker, for government to do something with this story and maybe be supportive of the community down there and Mr. Blankenship to someday tell this story. I think there's even great potential possibly to do a movie about this story. There's, and it wouldn't be the government obviously doing that, but there is a story that can be told, and the nice thing about it is there's so much mystery here that it leaves it open to interpretation. And of course, if something like that happened, Mr. Speaker, that would also help with the telling of the story from a tourist perspective, from a visitor perspective. And so I'm pleased to see that the government appears to be, and we're going to discuss this more obviously, but that the government appears to be recognizing Mr. Blankenship and is trying to protect him from any changes. Certainly the legislation is not out to hurt anybody. If anything, it's out as a good thing to protect cultural significance in this province. But I'm glad to see there's some recognition that Mr. Blankenship's efforts to recover this treasure and the investment that he's made in it will not be lost. And I'm sure that in this day and age that he would be more than happy to I wouldn't want to speak for him, but I'm sure that he would be more than happy to be cooperative with government to ensure that any activity is done in a respectful manner and that it does not inadvertently destroy any cultural significance on Oak Island. I did meet a couple of people, Mr. Speaker, over the years, one in fact this summer in Port Hood during Chestico Days. And it was before the boat parade, so I was of sound mind and I had good perspective. And Mr. Speaker, this gentleman, actually, he works in Halifax here. I won't say any more about him, just out of respect for his privacy, but he believes that the changes that were proposed are a good thing. And he has a lot of interest and involvement in cultural significance in the province. And he made some good points to me that made good sense on this matter. And I also know John Wesley Chisholm that the minister had referenced, the honourable member had referenced as well. And Mr. Speaker, we do look forward to speaking further on this matter during third reading, and thank you for the opportunity to comment upon it today.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to speak on the repeal of the Treasure Trove Act and an antiquated and dated piece of legislation and its replacement by Bill 81, the Oak Island Treasure Act. Mr. Speaker, our government opted for the repeal of the current act only after reviewing the lengthy and comprehensive Blackstone report that came out in a 2005 study prior to our government taking office. And this report focused on a number of critical areas, including how to improve protecting underwater cultural heritage, potential need for institutional change, and possible legal ramifications. This report, as noted, was lengthy, it was detailed, it was thorough, and literally hundreds of individuals and stakeholders were consulted, many of them experts in the field of marine archaeology. The authors of the report also examined how the science related to underwater assets is conducted in other jurisdictions. And the overwhelming message emanating from the report was that Nova Scotia has to make protecting our underwater cultural heritage a major priority. Mr. Speaker, to further emphasize why our government feels repealing the current Treasure Trove Act and enacting a more comprehensive, well-balanced piece of legislation to safeguard our marine archaeological heritage is so important, I wish to reference an article which appeared in the March 17th, 2004 edition of the Halifax Chronicle Herald in section A3. That related the discovery of the wreck of a French vessel, the Auguste de Bordeaux, which sank in a November storm in Aspy Bay off Cape Breton Island. And I know my colleagues from Cape Breton know where Aspy Bay is. With your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read an excerpt from what was reported in the provincial paper of the day, and it said this: a group of investors from Syracuse are helping raise a 242-year-old shipwreck off the northern coast of Nova Scotia, a find that's yielded gold and silver coins, jewelry, and silverware. More importantly, says Norman Miles, a dramatic episode in North American history is being fleshed out. Our duty, and this is his quote, our duty is to teach the world what happened there, Miles said. And as we teach the world, this collection will grow in value because it will become sought after by those who have an interest in this time and place in history. The sinking of the Auguste de Bordeaux during a vicious November storm in 1761 was the starting point for one survivor's remarkable journey. And this is remarkable. Listen to this. Saint-Luc de Lacorne, a French military hero and one of the wealthiest men in Canada, was one of only 7 people to survive the wreck that claimed 114 lives. He then walked hundreds of kilometers during the worst of winter back to Quebec City. In other words, he walked from Aspy Bay to Quebec City in the winter. Lacorne's story, there you go. Lacorne's story and that of Auguste Expedition LLC's efforts to recover artifacts from the shipwreck will be told in a documentary this week on National Geographic Channel. So it was made into a documentary as well. The Auguste de Bordeaux, a wooden sailing ship built in 1747 and 1748 in France, was carrying 121 passengers from Quebec to France. The passengers, many of whom were rich, were being deported after France lost the 7 Years' War to Great Britain. Among them was Lacorne, wealthy fur trader. His 2 sons, his brother, and 2 nephews perished when the ship sank. But Lacorne managed to get to shore. His journal, which recounts the wreck and his trek through the wilderness afterwards, survives to tell his story. From Aspy Bay, where the Auguste sank, divers are adding artifacts to the story. Among other treasures, they have found silverware bearing Lacorne's ornate coat of arms. But after saying all that, Mr. Speaker, this last line is the most important line in the story. And it says simply this, and this is the last line of this story that was in the Chronicle Herald on March 17th, 2004. The government of Nova Scotia is entitled to some of the treasure, but most will remain the property of the expedition. It is the last line of this article, as I pointed out, that is significant to this debate, Mr. Speaker, and that line again, just in case we missed it here, is, quote, the government of Nova Scotia is entitled to some of the treasure, but most will remain the property of the expedition. What was taken from the wreck of the Auguste de Bordeaux, Mr. Speaker, was an important part of our history and an equally important part of our heritage. Such practices cannot be allowed to continue. Our government will not allow this to happen again, and that is why in July of this year, our government announced its intention to do away with the Antiquated Treasure Trove Act, and that's why today we're introducing Bill 81, the Oak Island Treasure Act, to replace it. Mr. Speaker, the previous act had allowed treasure hunters to actively look for treasure on land and underwater in our province, but more importantly, and I would add misguidedly, it allowed these hunters to keep 90% of what they found. Mr. Speaker, you will recall the article I read previously from the March 17, 2004 edition of the Chronicle Herald, and the line that stated, the government of Nova Scotia is entitled to some of the treasure, but most will remain the property of the expedition. Mr. Speaker, some of the treasure kept by the province amounted to 10%. That's right, Mr. Speaker, 10%. To put it another way, we were squandering, literally giving away our heritage. And I think the Honourable Minister mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again. As Darrell Kelman, the President of the Nova Scotia Archaeological Society, so aptly stated, and I quote, and this is his quote, the proposed changes to the law bring the province in line with the rest of the country and the rest of the Western world. Mr. Speaker, I submit to you that this is not a bad place to be, in line with the rest of Canada and the rest of the Western world. Again, referring to the Blackstone report, one of the options proposed was completely doing away with the Treasure Trove Act, and wisely, this was the course of action taken by our government. It was also the course of action recommended by voluntary planning in a report back in 2006. This act was definitely passed its best before date, in my opinion. The report's writers concluded that Nova Scotia needs to make managing its underwater cultural heritage more of a priority, and further noted that doing away with the Act reflects an approach more consistent with UNESCO policy, and further that it presented little risk with the sovereignty immunity claims of other countries. Nova Scotia has much to learn from other jurisdictions which have given significantly greater weight to their underwater assets and cultural heritage. The report recommended that a full-time provincial marine archaeologist be hired and that recreational divers should be schooled regarding marine archaeology and encouraged to search for underwater cultural heritage artifacts. Mr. Speaker, the report on which this new legislation is based went on to explain that continued unauthorized treasure hunting could be minimized and indeed eliminated by good laws, policies, operational structures, and appropriate levels of funding. Mr. Speaker, under the new bill, anyone caught removing artifacts without a heritage research permit can be sanctioned with a fine. Our government realized that simply quashing treasure hunting isn't going to, in itself, address better protecting our underwater cultural heritage. Rather, what's now needed is a coordinated and systematic approach to improve marine archaeology in the province, both in the public and the private sectors. Mr. Speaker, the good news is that this is already happening to a degree. For example, the Nova Scotia Archaeological Society held its first course in marine archaeology this past June, with more than a dozen people, many of them scuba divers, participating. Other groups like the Goresbrook Institute at St. Mary's University have also taken an active interest in this area, hosting a symposium earlier this year in which they examined the socio-economic impacts of treasure hunting in the province. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Bob Rondo, a marine archaeologist who lives in my part of the province, a beautiful South Shore, feels that the lack of involvement by academia in this important area has also been a problem. Not long ago, he was quoted as saying that despite the fact that Nova Scotia has one of the richest marine histories in the world, no university here offers a degree in marine archaeology. He also feels all Nova Scotians, and I agree with him, should be better educated about their underwater cultural heritage. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more. What we are talking about here is our culture. It is our heritage. It is our past, and it is a rich and beautiful one. Mr. Speaker, repealing the archaic Treasure Trove Act will help us preserve what is rightfully the birthright of all Nova Scotians. That is why our government is repealing it and introducing Bill 81. Mr. Speaker, unlike previous governments, our government understands that Nova Scotians do not want priceless pieces of their coastal history pilfered away and sold on the world market. Our government will not stand by and let treasure troving rest in the hands of the private sector. History has shown that the private sector's primary interest is the revenue generated by selling pieces of our history. Artifacts and materials located by the private sector may never be seen by any Nova Scotians or never be viewed by them. So, Mr. Speaker, our government consulted stakeholders.
Order, please. There seems to be a lot of chatter in the chamber tonight, so I was wondering if those members would take that outside right now. The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, our government consulted stakeholders from the salvage industry, as well as private individuals and those from government, and those with a special interest in our cultural heritage. This is how we have arrived at the place where we find ourselves today. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary, this Premier, this Minister, and this government is showing genuine leadership by bringing Nova Scotia's approach to protecting marine heritage into line with other Canadian jurisdictions and, indeed, as stated earlier, those in the Western world. We have been the only province in Canada to allow treasure hunting. By implementing this change, our province will reflect the United Nations' preferred approach to marine heritage preservation. Mr. Speaker, our province is working on developing options for enhancing marine archaeological protection and understanding. Our focus will be on research and recovery of treasure following archaeological best practices. Mr. Speaker, the Treasure Trove Act was never intended to determine how all Nova Scotians' marine heritage was managed, and this government is showing the leadership necessary by acting on the recommendations from the task force and the Blackstone report. Today, we are taking a giant step toward preserving the birthright of all Nova Scotians. And I'm very proud to be able to speak on this bill, and I thank the Minister and the government for their very, very aggressive action on this area. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Community Service is very eager to get up and speak on this bill, so I'll try not to speak too long. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the two ministers for bringing in this bill. I think this is an important move in the preservation of the underwater cultural artifacts in Nova Scotia. And indeed, it does bring us in line with other provinces, and I'm very happy to see this come forward. Indeed, this is something that back in fact, some people may be fully aware that the UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Artifacts was first ratified in 2001, and I had the privilege to be the student of Dr. Elizabeth Mann-Borghese at the time, who was one of the leading authorities of the Law of the Sea Convention, and I worked with her actually on this the development of this convention. It came into force January 2nd, 2009, and Canada ratified it. And it's been a little bit of an embarrassment that Nova Scotia had, until obviously this comes into force, would be the only province that had not ratified it. And while it's reason or taken the action necessary to be a signatory to it, it's worth noting that, of course, while we can make jokes about the fact that Saskatchewan or Alberta probably it didn't take much to change the rules to protect underwater artifacts, it is significant in places such as the Great Lakes, where they have some of our great underwater artifacts, but also up north. We often forget about some of the underwater archaeology up north, as well as on the West Coast. I know there's a number of people that want to speak, so there's just a few issues I wanted to talk about. There are one of the things that we've heard come out and say, well, this is terrible. It's going to mean the artifacts sit on the bottom of the ocean, and well, we really need to examine that, because at the moment, many of the bits of treasure, or so-called treasure, that are collected end up in vaults in private collectors' homes, and I'm not sure that that's any better. And in fact, the convention has a number of principles on state cooperation and so forth, and the UNESCO Convention on this issue has 4 basic principles. One is that you preserve your underwater cultural heritage. The second one is that while it is preferred that you leave it on site and don't disturb it, there are provisions for having it in universities, or for example, St. Mary's University, which has an archaeology program, may wish to undertake activities. I know that there are actually private companies in Nova Scotia, such as Cultural Resource Management, who do not sell the treasure, but in fact do get grants and support to go out and look at cultural resources. The main feature of the UNESCO convention was that there would be no commercial exploitation of underwater cultural heritage resources, and that's what makes the bill that the ministers have brought forward so important. That's what this gets rid of. This doesn't mean that divers like myself, or I know the Minister of Fisheries, also a scuba diver, that we can't go out and look at wrecks or so forth. That's not what it means at all. What it means is that those wrecks will be there, and I can tell you that, for example, having dove many times on the wreck of the SS Atlantic, that you have, every time you go there, it seems that more of the champagne bottles are gone. And it used to be a famous place to go dive and see the champagne bottles still sitting there on the bottom. They are long since gone now. Now, granted, our sea states are such that some of them are naturally destroyed, and I'm fully willing to admit that, but I'm also aware that many of them have been taken and sit on the shelves of homes, and when in fact it would be much better for us to be able to appreciate that in the Maritime Museum, or perhaps a museum in Terrence Bay. There are local museums all over this province who could benefit. We need only look at Louisbourg in Cape Breton West, I think that's the right riding, where the Louisbourg Harbour is actually protected federally in this manner. And there is actually, and it goes through ups and downs, but there are ups and downs related to the tourism industry, related to diving, and divers go in and actually look at the wrecks, that the cannons are still there, and many of those artifacts, and it's extremely important. The fact is, we need to make sure that our cultural resources are not irretrievably lost, because once they're lost, we don't get them back. it's worth noting also that the United Nations has created a capacity building program around this convention, which actually, once you have the laws in place that allow the appropriate protection of our cultural resources, in fact, the it opens you up to grants from the United Nations for cultural exploitation in the underwater resources. This convention is internationally recognized as the leading guideline for activities related to heritage, and I'm very pleased in that respect to see this come forward. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the fact that there have been a lot of organizations and groups that have lobbied for this over the years. I know John Wesley Chisholm, who was at the Minister's press conference the other day, Cultural Resource Management, the Shubenacadie Canal Commission was one of the groups that had lobbied for the repeal of the Treasure Trove Act. And there's many, many more, and if I try and list them all, I absolutely forget some, but if I recall correctly, the Lighthouse Society was also at one time doing this because of some of the artifacts associated around Sambro Island in particular. The fact is that there are things that have to be done. There are elements of cultural protection underwater that we have no control over, such as environmental influences. We're never going to be able to stop the kind of ocean currents we have here, so there are always going to be things that, that will cause some of these sites to degrade. But there are things we can do, including the monitoring of trawling and construction activities, legal protection such as the Minister is taking today, and also in making sure that that this is interpreted for the public and for tourists that may come here, and supporting our local museums and cultural organizations who may wish to take advantage of the opportunities this possesses. You know, in closing, I know my honourable colleague from Digby Annapolis has raised the spectre of possible black markets, and you know, I would argue that the black market environment for many of these resources exists now. It will exist 10 years from now. It will exist 50 years from now. We don't stop it now. We won't ever be able to stop it all, but the next step may be for us all to work together and look at the penalties in the Treasure, or in the Special Places Act and things like that, to make sure that the penalties are sufficient enough to be a deterrent. Mr. Speaker, I understand there are a number of other people who would like to speak, so I will take my place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thought I'd just take a minute or two today to talk to this. I hadn't planned to, but hearing what's been, quite an interesting history lesson, or maybe longer than that, Minister. Quite a history lesson from a couple of the members in this House, and me being a bit of a history buff, I do enjoy our local history, but more importantly, I was sitting thinking about this bill and some of the things being said, and wondered, how is it that we're solely writing a bill for Oak Island? That's the first thing, and it was the honourable member from Digby and Annapolis there who had kind of raised this treasure troving on the beaches, him being a beachcomber and his second love after politics perhaps and fishing. But anyway, when you get thinking about some of these things, you have to wonder, how can you control it at all? And it's going to be a very difficult task to monitor it, number one, and that was just one example. There are many. We see treasures depending on what you refer to as a treasure. Is that outlined in the bill? And I haven't been through it all specifically. Perhaps it is to some degree, but we talked about a couple of different things in the bill, and I'll just read a piece of it, and I know I won't quote the whole bill, but treasure means precious stones or metals in the state other than their natural state. Well, that could be interesting to debate that at any point in time by way of trying to fine somebody, as we've just heard. You know, we talk about penalties for these fines, and I don't know how you're ever going to win on this one, but you know, you put a bill in and it's specific to Oak Island, but this happens all over Nova Scotia. There are many treasure trove places in this province, down in the Parsborough area and all along the basin, and down along where I live, down my way, we hear about Blue Beach and all the finds and the fossils. And are those treasures? Not as described in here, maybe, or maybe not. Are fossils a treasure? Maybe in some people's minds they are a treasure. Who knows? But there are a variety of things that wash up, as the honourable member has talked about. How is that any different? Now, they're on land. How is that any different than walking down the street and picking up a quarter? That's also a treasure. That's a find in some people's minds. We see these people with the, I don't know what you call them, the little technology machines that...
Metal detector.
Metal detector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Metal detectors. A long day here, I guess. Metal detectors, are those treasures? Perhaps they are. I think probably they are, as described by precious stones and metals. Is it when my children go to the beach? Now, my kids like to go to the beach and they like to pick up shells. Are those treasures? Are those precious stones? Perhaps they are to them. Those are treasures. How are we going to control it? I don't know how you know, the idea of this bill may be a good one, but again, I come back to Wyoming, Oak Island, and Lunenburg County, and I know that's been going on for many, many, many years, and it's a great history lesson down there, and there have been many who have attempted to find some mysterious gold. I often wonder if the mystery in itself is the fact that there is no mystery. You have to wonder about that, and if you read enough about it, and I've read extensively on that area because I like provincial history, Nova Scotia history, maritime history, etc., there's an opportunity. I don't know how we're going to capture all that in a bill, and I hope that there's some speakers through law amendments, and they just don't let it pass through for the sake of being what it is. But it doesn't speak in here that I saw anywhere, and maybe I've missed it, but it's got nothing to do with treasures that are under the water. We talked a little bit about that. Whose jurisdiction is that? It seems that everything under the water is Ottawa's jurisdiction, and everything on the ground is the provincial jurisdiction. How does something coming from the water legally become the jurisdiction of the province? Those questions have yet to be answered, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know that there are lawyers in this House who could probably answer that or make an attempt to answer that. But anyway, again, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and point out a few of the things that have been brought up historically here, and some of the finds. Again, a very interesting piece about finding a piece of wood, shells. How are you going to monitor it? And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if you can't monitor this and there are no penalties, then why are we going forward with it at all? So anyway, Mr. Speaker, just wanted to take a couple of minutes. I do know that there are other speakers that do want to get up before the day is out today and have a few words on the bill. So with that, I'll take my place. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the Honourable Minister for Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to speak this evening. And because of the fact, this is even more dear to me because the Oak Island is in my constituency of Chester St. Margaret's. And an act to regulate the searching for treasure on Oak Island, which, as I just said, I'm proud to say is part of my constituency of Chester St. Margaret's. I am so pleased that our government is taking action on protecting our underwater cultural heritage, and at the same time recognizes the significant investments made in search for the treasure on Oak Island. Certainly, there are many theories about where the treasure comes from, and the most popular is that it belonged to Captain Kidd. Now, I am very fortunate that it's in my constituency and that I have been on the island many times, and recently had a wonderful exploration of the island and learned even more. Mr. Speaker, what I'd like for people to know is that the investments made in the treasure search on Oak Island has not only been in financial terms and in terms of time, it is also has been in terms of loss of life. And this is on a personal note for me because my family have been family friends of the Rosignol family, and the father and the son lost their lives on Oak Island. Mr. Speaker, that fateful day that Mr. Rosignol lost his life, he had gone down one of the, what people call the money pits. And something happened, and he started to yell for his son and for anyone else that could hear him, Mr. Speaker. And hearing his father's cries, his son came running to the pit and started to descend down the pit and was overcome by gases, and he also died. Another gentleman who was hired to work that day on the top area, on the ground level, also heard those screams for help and did not know that the son had passed away from the gases trying to save his father. And he went down in the pit and lost his life. So there was 3 lives that were lost that one day, and that would have been back in the early 60s. I knew the wife of the husband and the mother, of course, of the son, and she's a very wonderful lady. She passed away a few years ago, but a very sad story to lose your husband and child in one day. So unfortunately, the cloud of death overcoming Oak Island did not stop there. And what is very interesting is that it certainly then created a fear among people. And what is the mystery around Oak Island? And the fact that there's not just a mystery, now the island had ghosts. In fact, it's very interesting to know that the legend says that once 7 people die looking for the treasure will be found. Presently, 6 people have lost their lives. And as the honourable member in the opposition said, Mr. Blankenship almost was the 7th person, which is very ironic in the fact that Mr. Blankenship has dedicated his life to find the treasure. The mystery of the Oak Island treasure is known throughout the world. It's an international icon for the province of Nova Scotia. We are very fortunate in the fact that we have Oak Island, and the story behind Oak Island draws attention on an international tourism level, and we need to boast about that. There has been many television documentaries, radio shows, and books written and focusing on Oak Island. Major discussions have taken place over the years of whether there's really a treasure there. But I think Mr. Blankenship would really push you on that issue. He and others have invested millions and millions of dollars looking for that treasure. And as I said, people have lost their lives looking for that treasure. And he, Mr. Blankenship, who is, I believe, in his 80s now, is still dedicated to finding that treasure. And that's why it's so important that this government has recognized that within creating the Oak Island Treasure Trove Act. Mr. Blankenship certainly has been teased over the years, because if you go on the island, you will discover that there's clues strategically placed on the island. You can go there today and you can see huge rocks that have been carved with something years and years, hundreds of years ago, that have a clue to where that treasure may be. You can see the formation of even trees that point towards where the treasure may be. As I said, large rocks have been found in certain positions. Also, when they have been drilling in the money pit, they have discovered certain artifacts have been brought up by the end of the drill. And in fact, they've not too long ago, they had discovered pieces of paper came up on the bit of the drill, and they were able to have those analyzed back to the 17 and 1800s. So there's little clues there in the money pits. Amazingly enough, the money pits are about 200 feet deep. And there's a set of tunnels running in the money pits. And then there's booby traps throughout. And that's what's so interesting. How did they do that many years ago? It's like the pyramids. That's what goes through your mind, is how were they able to do that? But it is there. So in closing, it's interesting to know that the treasure was originally, the island was discovered by 3 young teenagers. And even Franklin Roosevelt had an interest in trying to find the treasure. He had a company called the Old Gold Salvage Group. And he tried to do some searching in 1909. Even Earl Flynn had a desire to find the treasure until he found out that a company belonging to actor John Wayne had the searching rights. So there's a lot of stories around this. So Mr. Blankenship's desire to find the treasure has been a great one, but the mystery continues. But I do know one thing, that the Treasure Trove Act has been found through the initiative of this government by protecting the treasures of the past and enabling Mr. Blankenship to continue his dream to discover the Oak Island treasure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I would like I would like to now adjourn debate on Bill 81. Thank you.
Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. I will now recognize the Deputy Government House Leader, the Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes government business for today. I would like to now rise to meet again tomorrow between the hours of 9 and 12, where after daily routine, we'll, if time permits, call government motions, address and reply, and public bills for second reading, Bill number 81, Bill number 82, and Bill number 83.
Thank you. The motion for adjournment has been called. All those in favor? Aye. Those against? Motion is carried. We have now reached the hour of interruption. With the resolution being said earlier, therefore be it resolved that no farms, no food organization be supported in a timely manner by implementing recommendations from the Agricultural Land Review Committee's recent report. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased tonight to rise in my place and speak on this very important issue facing Nova Scotia. Facing perhaps my area, the Annapolis Valley, to a much greater extent than other parts of the province. This organization, No Farms, No Food, has been in existence now for a number of years. As they saw some erosion of the farmland in the Annapolis Valley. And for that reason, they became concerned. They took on first, of course, Kings County Council to push back against the sell-off of fairly significant areas of farmland. And it happens now that we have done, I think, what is a wonderful study commissioned by the Minister of Agriculture to take a look at the future of preserving agricultural land in Nova Scotia. And to that effect, he set in motion a committee made up of people who, in their own right, had a great understanding of the land base and the agricultural land base of Nova Scotia, and have brought forth a very, very detailed, a very comprehensive report. It's my only copy. I'm not going to submit it, but I do want to reference it during my time. And it so happens that the main and central concept that comes out of this document with recommendations to the minister is that Class 2 and Class 3 soils and Class 4, that is cleared land, remain to be preserved for agriculture in Nova Scotia. You know, each of us, as we come along as members